So our next speaker now is going to be Dr. Gary Wright, he, him, and he will be introduced by Kate Cossia, they, them, a second-year MTSU student in the Mathematics and Science Education PhD program. Help me welcome them to the stage.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Hope everybody's having a great day. So today I have the honor of introducing Dr. Gary Wright. Dr. Wright's currently an assistant professor of science education in the Department of Learning, Teaching, and Curriculum at the University of Missouri. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Biology from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington and taught high school science in rural areas of North Carolina for 3 years. He received a Master of Education in Science Education and his PhD in Learning and Teaching in Science, Technology, and Engineering and Mathematics from North Carolina State University, where he received the Outstanding Doctoral Research Award from the National Association of Research in Science Teaching. After completing his postdoctoral fellowship at NC State, he joined the faculty at the University of Missouri as an assistant professor. Dr. Wright's research focuses on justice-oriented science teaching and gender and sexual diversity inclusive education. He's particularly interested in preparing pre-service and in-service teachers to work with and learn from LGBTQ students. His recent work includes the development of a framework for gender and sexual diversity inclusive STEM education that can help STEM education to be more equitable and inclusive. Dr. Wright's research interests also include mentoring in STEM, where he explored the impacts of implementing a distance near-peer mentoring model on the STEM identity of underserved students living both in rural areas of the United States and Botswana. So please give everyone a round of applause and welcome Dr. Gary Wright.
Good evening, everybody. I'd like to start just by saying, please bear with me. I developed a little bit of a head cold yesterday on my flight, and I can kind of hear myself talk, so I might be either really loud or really quiet because I can't really hear myself. So just let me know if I need to speak up or if I need to be a little bit more quieter. My name is Dr. Gary Wright. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm an assistant professor of science education at the University of Missouri. And today I'm going to be talking with you all about my scholarship focused on empowering LGBTQ youth through science education. Just to get started, in case you can't see me, I just want to give you a brief description of myself. I'm a 31-year-old white cis man. I'm tall with brown hair, and I'm wearing red glasses and a black suit. So for today's agenda, we're going to start off just by an introduction of who I am. I'm going to talk about my positionality as a researcher and as an educator, talk about what it's like to be LGBTQ in Missouri specifically. There's a lot of parallels with a lot of other southern states, but I'm going to focus in on Missouri where my work is really shaped. And then I'm going to dive into 3 different areas of my scholarship. So I work to empower LGBTQ youth through 3 mechanisms. I work to create or foster supportive teachers, develop inclusive curriculum, as well as provide authentic mentoring opportunities to LGBTQ youth. So here's just a brief overview of who I am. I've already said where I'm coming from, and we've heard a little bit about my background. I'm a former high school science teacher. I did teach for 3 years in rural North Carolina communities, and then I did my postdoc at NC State. Currently, I'm working within Missouri as a board member of the Center Project, which is Mid-Missouri's LGBTQIA+ community center, where we work to advocate for LGBTQ folks all throughout Missouri, particularly in the Columbia area. And as was mentioned, my research focuses on these 3 broad areas of justice-oriented and LGBTQ inclusive science education, as well as mentoring. So a little bit about my positionality and who I am. I grew up and taught in rural conservative North Carolina. I'm a first-generation college student, which means I'm the first and only member of my family to achieve any degree or pursue any higher education beyond a high school diploma. And at the same time, I draw on several identities, some of which have afforded me privileges that allow me to navigate spaces in a privileged way, and some identities that have really impacted my experiences as a queer person. So I identify as a white, cisgender, gay male. Particularly those identities of being white and cisgender do afford me a lot of privileges as a queer person. This is important because research and teaching is not culturally neutral. We know that within research and teaching, there's going to be specific ways of knowing and communicating that are linked to these dominant ideas, things like being white, cisgender, English-speaking cultures, et cetera. And I truly believe that research and teaching should be a transformative practice. So I'm drawing on my positionality to transform science education. I want to dive in a little bit more about where I'm coming from because it really lays the groundwork of my passion, particularly working with rural communities. So I grew up in North Carolina, and it's this very small county towards the north called Youngsville, or Franklin County, but Youngsville is the town. And I want to give you a little bit of context about it. In 2010, which is the year that I graduated high school, Youngsville itself had a population of 851 folks. So it's a really small town. The school building was built in 1907, and it remained the exact same when I attended that high school with no adjustments. They recently shut down the school, but that kind of speaks to just the sort of status of those communities. And the total student population was 834. You might wonder, why is that so close to the total population? It's because our high school was a feeder school for a lot of the surrounding small rural counties. So students travel from Franklin, Franklinton, Lewisburg, Youngsville, things like that. But I raise this point because this has really shaped my passion in supporting rural teachers. I was one of those queer rural kids in these spaces, and so it's really important to me to go back to that space and empower youth. In 2023, the ACLU posted that that they tracked over 510 anti-LGBTQ bills in the United States. I wanted to update that number for 2024, but it's just really depressing. And we haven't even made it through a full year yet. So I didn't even want to put myself in that space. Nonetheless, we can see that across the US, we see some patterns, but we see this onslaught of anti-LGBTQ bills. So this is important because it lays the groundwork of why this work has to happen. We're seeing it not just in local communities, we're seeing it globally, nationally, also internationally as well. And now I want to dive a little bit into what it's like to be LGBTQ in Missouri. These are just a couple of statistics from the Movement Advancement Project. It's a really useful tool if you're interested in exploring LGBTQ policies, practices, legislation across the different states. Through the website, you can get different snapshots of different states, as well as get different tallies for how supportive or inclusive they are of LGBTQ folks. So it's a really useful resource. We see that the total LGBTQ population in Missouri, at least of 2020, that number is likely higher, over 217,000 folks. And the percent of LGBTQ adults raising children is 26%. These are just a couple of the numbers, but again, it speaks to the importance of raising these identities in science education. They're there in these communities, and we want to raise those voices in the curriculum. So what's happening in Missouri? Well, there's actually a terrible onslaught of different legislation happening, many of which are rooted in poor ideas of science. And I'm going to get to that conversation in just a few moments. But this is just an overview. There are broad religious exemption laws that allow businesses, nonprofit organizations, things like that, to discriminate on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. There are laws and policies that prevent schools and districts from passing anti-bullying and anti-discrimination laws. Trans students cannot participate in school sports based on their gender identity. There's a ban on gender-affirming healthcare for trans youth. This is really important. Somebody was talking earlier, I think on the panel, about the role that institutions play, or maybe, in fact, their silence. And the University of Missouri actually runs Missouri's healthcare system. They are the largest healthcare system in the state. And University of Missouri, when the ban came out, they were in full support of the ban. And the reason why is because of liability for the doctors should they provide gender-affirming surgery to minors, and then they change their mind. That's rooted in a very poor understanding, because in fact, less than 1% of people who undergo gender-affirming surgery actually change their minds, right? So the University of Missouri still has work to do, and their silence has been deafening for the queer faculty and students on campus. Missouri requires proof of surgery in order to change your gender marker. And also at the same time, Missouri is very antiquated. You actually have to post your gender change in the local newspaper, and you actually have to make that transition public to your community members. And then finally, Missouri still has HIV criminalization laws that penalize folks for purposefully or unintentionally transmitting HIV or AIDS. I think it's also important to point out, and this speaks to the framework that I'm going to share with you all in a few moments, inaction is also a political act. So while in Missouri, there are no state protections for sexual orientation or gender identity on the basis of fair housing, private employment, public accommodations like bathrooms, drag spaces. There are no bans on conversion therapy. And in fact, in a few counties, conversion therapy is still legal in a few counties within Missouri. And there's no protections for adoption or foster care for queer and trans folks. So I lay this groundwork because, as you can imagine, it probably trickles down to students in the schools, right? And research shows that. So there is a national school climate survey that is published each year by GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. And when they surveyed over 23,000 students across the United States and various schools, they found that 68% of students reported feeling unsafe at school because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. And then you can see that number differ based on sexual orientation, gender expression, or gender identity. Most students felt unsafe because of a multitude of those identities. When we think about education research, the most simplest idea is that kids can't learn when they don't feel safe. And so this really speaks to an issue that LGBTQ students are facing, and that if they're not feeling safe, they're definitely not engaging and learning in our classes. When we sampled those same students and asked them, how many of you have seen any representation, positive or negative, of LGBTQ content in your coursework? 71% of students said no. Only 14% said that they saw positive representations. 12% saw negative, and then there was a smaller fraction that saw a mixture of those. So I want to zoom in a little bit closer into where I'm interested, which is science. And so they broke this down by the different discipline areas. And when you look at science, out of the total population, that's only 12.4% that were taught positive representation of LGBTQ, or excuse me, let me backtrack. 12% of the students that said they saw positive representation in their classes said that they saw it in science classes. When we translate that to the whole population of students that were surveyed, that's only 2% of students that said in their science classes they saw any representation or positive representation of LGBTQ ideas. As I mentioned, LGBTQ ideas are often rooted in a poor understanding of science. So science education is directly implicated in addressing this issue. We know that the things that I mentioned earlier, my 3 areas of research, supportive teachers, inclusive curriculum, and authentic mentoring opportunities, can lead to a host of positive impacts. Feeling less unsafe, improved academic performance, a greater sense of school belonging and well-being, enhanced empathy and acceptance of all students, not just your queer and trans students, and also this idea of improved equity literacy. So this leads to the conversation of how is science implicated? I've already said this several times, such that anti-LGBTQ laws are rooted in a poor understanding of science. If I were to ask you all to reflect back on, for example, your biology courses, you can probably recall a few simple facts. You may have been taught something like XX means you're female, XY means you're male. If you have a lot of testosterone, you're a male. If you have a lot of estrogen, you're a female. We learn in science that we think, ways to group people by male, female on the basis of chromosomes, genetic markers, sexual characteristics. But science is not that simple, and science actually shows us a very different version of this. And when we think about the historical idea of science education, it often emphasizes these ideas of objectivism and determinism, which really run counterintuitive to this idea of social identities being allowed in science. In other words, science is viewed as this hard subject where social identities, social perspectives don't matter. The science is the science, and we're going to leave those identities at the door. But that's actually not productive. Earlier today, one of the speakers was talking about the impact that there was no federal legislation or regulations that require the collection or reporting of LGBTQ folks. That's particularly the case for the National Science Foundation. So this paper here from Jonathan Freeman, the NSF actually does not collect any data on sexual orientation or gender identity or the topics like those or those related topics. And so if we're not even measuring these ideas, or if we're not even collecting data about who these scholars are, there's no way that we can identify ways to support those folks. So at a bare minimum, I think we should be at least measuring and collecting that data. My goal here is not to quiz you on this science content here, but it's to show you the diversity of sex. So this comes from a Nature article that was published, I want to say 2019-ish. Don't quote me on that. But it's a relatively recent infographic. And what you can see is that on the left side, it is the typical female as XX. And then on the right side, you have the typical male as XY. But in between, you have all these chromosomal and genetic variations that exist. Everybody who exists between those two kind of endpoints, we consider those folks, or we call those folks intersex. And in fact, 1 in 500 folks identify as intersex. That's actually a lot higher probably than people think. So this is impacting many folks. When we take this conversation outside of humans in a biology or in science education, we see that this still holds true, and that these binaries of XX, XY, testosterone, estrogen, they're not useful. So let's take, for example, the idea of sea turtles. Their sex is actually determined based on environmental temperature. So if the temperature is a little bit cooler, they're going to develop into male. And if it's within a prime warm temperature, those sea turtles will develop into females, right? So in this instance, they don't conform to those binary views of human sex. How do we make sense of that? How are we teaching that? Let's move this on to the idea of pigeons. So if you know anything about pigeons' chromosomes, males are actually ZZ. So they don't even use XY, and they're homozygous. Whereas in humans, the homozygous XX is female. So this pattern doesn't hold anymore when we take it to these other animal species. Again, how are we making sense of that, and how are we incorporating that into our content so that we can show students that sex is not that binary, and science does not support a binary view of sex? So I'm ready to dive into how I've set up my research agenda. This was a very interesting paper to write because it came out of my preliminary exams as part of my PhD program. I wrote it for what we called my major exam. And I had to develop this framework because the field is very underdeveloped, particularly within STEM education. Particularly within STEM education and within science education. So I set out to develop a framework. I needed to know if I want to talk about GSD, which by the way stands for gender and sexual diversity, GSD, inclusive STEM education, I need to develop a definition of it. I needed to develop a framework to guide my research. So I systematically reviewed 81 publications across science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education research. I used inductive thematic analysis and epistemic network analysis. And I developed a framework that's centered around these 3 paradigms of GSD inclusive education, meaning that when we go into schools and see how are teachers integrating these practices, they're integrating it in one of 3 ways, either through a focus on safety, which is, hey, I have a resource corner here with suicide hotline numbers, with helpful brochures, things like that. That's a useful and productive place to start, but that should not be our end point. So beyond safety, we have this idea of equity, which is about representation, including that content into the curriculum. Maybe it's showing folks an LGBTQ scientist, for example, and incorporating that into your teaching. And then finally, we have a critical approach. this is kind of the more hefty approach, if you will, where the goal is to have teachers actually disrupt and change their curriculum. So, for example, if you go look at the most popular biology textbook that is used, there's tons of examples of inaccurate and non-inclusive genetic descriptions within some of those chapters. So teaching teachers how to recognize those and then change that in a way so that they're providing students with the most accurate, up-to-date information, that's really representing the critical paradigm. I mentioned this term equity literacy. It was developed by a scholar named Paul Gorski. And if you're not familiar with Gorski, I really recommend you check him out. He's developed this whole Equity Literacy Institute. But I mentioned earlier that inaction is also a political act. And really central to Paul Gorski's idea of equity literacy is this idea that teaching for equity is a political act. We know that, but so is not teaching for equity. So we need to call those folks out who are not teaching for equity and show them that that is also a political act. So when I think about this framework, it's grounded in equity literacy. The hope is that by drawing on this framework, I can support teachers in recognizing forms of bias, responding to those biases, redressing them, and then ultimately sustaining them for a longer period of time, perhaps even when they're no longer in that context or institution. So this is the framework that I developed. On the left side, you can see the three paradigms that I mentioned, ranging from safety to critical. And the second column are the 6 constructs that I identified. So when I looked at all 81 papers, these were the 6 ideas that came out: heteronormativity, embodiment, identity, epistemic knowledge of science and inquiry, social justice, and a focus on gender and sexual diversity language. So this framework has really been guiding my scholarship. On the intervention side, it shows how to design professional development for teachers to support their enactment of GSD inclusive science teaching, drawing on all 3 paradigms. And then on the far right are these outcomes that impact students. And so there's sort of 2 parts here, focusing on the teachers within the intervention, and then eventually moving to the student side of things and seeing how does this actually impact student outcomes, from feelings of safety all the way down to equity literacy. So I want to start in by talking about supportive teachers. I think it's important to illustrate that this isn't me saying this. One of the guiding organizations in the field of science teacher education, the National Science Teaching Association, calls on us explicitly to address this. They said we must recognize and respect diversity within gender and sexuality to include LGBTQ students, and we have to think about language, curriculum materials, and pedagogical choices, how they impact belonging and competence. So I'm grounding this research agenda in the organization that's guiding our field's work. What's the issue, though? Well, GSD generally isn't addressed often in teacher education programs. And when it is, it follows one of those 3 paradigms that I mentioned. There's an explicit focus on attitudes and beliefs about sexual orientation. The field honestly hasn't really caught up. When we think about some of the initial work, the focus was on being gay or lesbian, but this idea of gender and sexuality transcends sexual orientation. We have gender expression, gender identity, things like that. So the focus on sexual orientation, while a productive place to start, is rather limiting. And then there's a gap specifically within science teacher education programs. So that's where my research really aims to fill this gap. I'm excited to share, I was hoping to share this paper with you all before my trip here, but literally like right in the airport on the way here, a paper that I've been working on now from my dissertation for 2 years now was finally accepted fully into JARST. So hopefully very soon you can go read this paper, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this research study. So for my early on in my PhD, I developed the framework, and then I moved to, I want to actually implement this framework with pre-service science teachers, and I want to see how it impacts their attitudes and beliefs. So I used a multiple case study design, and I designed a STEM teaching methods course using my GSD framework. The intervention lasted 5 weeks, and there were a series of activities I took students through. They explored some case-based argumentation from the National Center of Case Study Teaching and Science that was focused on GSD. They participated in a Socratic seminar about the origins of human and animal gender and sexual diversity. One of my favorites, and I'm going to actually preview this activity with you all and get you engaged in just a few moments, is students also worked on an HHMI, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute interactive module on sex verification testing of athletes. That's a very relevant, real conversation happening for trans students right now, and perhaps one of the most impactful activities that was done. We talk about how to support LGBTQ students in STEM from like organizations, resources, things like that. And then ultimately, how do we help teachers think about this from a funds of knowledge perspective? So I'm going to talk about this briefly, but oftentimes it's framed when we're talking about working with LGBTQ youth that they're victims that need to be saved. I'm not trying to discount the harm that has been done to LGBTQ people. I'm just sort of tired of being portrayed as somebody who needs to be saved. So how can we take this conversation to talk about the assets that I bring, the strengths that we bring? We were talking, for example, earlier about the ACT UP movement, right? That was led by LGBTQ people, queer and trans people. So like an asset that those students bring is advocacy, right? How are we tapping into that advocacy within our curriculum? Again, I don't think safety is negative. We just have to move beyond that. And so I originally framed this study as a mixed method study, but my reviewer said it's not mixed methods. It's a case study where you collected quantitative and qualitative data. So quantitatively, I saw a positive trend in their attitudes and beliefs. It was the qualitative part that was really interesting. Here's just a breakdown of my participants. There were very few of them, which is something that we can talk about if you're interested. Most of them identified as white. 3 out of 7 of them identified as bisexual. 5 were female. Fits the demographic of teachers that we see across the country. 5 out of 7 identified as cis women, and then 3 out of 7 were in biology education. And so to illustrate the findings of implementing this intervention, I want to tell you a very brief story about one of my participants, Drew. And then I'll very briefly tell you about another participant, Aria. Both names are pseudonyms. Drew was really interesting. He identified as a white, bisexual, cisgender male and was pursuing a degree in biology education. Prior to the intervention, Drew showed the most supportive attitudes and beliefs about GSD science teaching compared to his peers. So for example, interview data revealed that he mostly talked about it prior to the intervention in terms of student safety. I think that those students specifically often have a tougher time and need more support from understanding adults. After their intervention, there was not much quantitative changes because Drew was already so high, at least on a quantitative survey measure. But the interview data showed a more transformative and critical view. So after the intervention, in one of the activities I had those students do, Drew started writing about how he would, for the Punnett squares, use gender-neutral designations for the parents, i.e. parent 1 instead of father, or parent 2 instead of mother. So Drew started thinking about how can I change the curriculum and how it's being presented. Drew is an interesting case because in his post-interview, he even said to me, it definitely gave me some ways that I could incorporate these topics into the curriculum, but I'm not sure my thoughts really changed that dramatically about how I would work with LGBTQ students. Well, qualitatively, there was actually some really powerful changes that happened. Drew just wasn't really aware of them. So it made me wonder, how can I work to make folks like Drew more aware of those changes that they're going through? Aria is really interesting because prior to the intervention, she scored the highest on the heteronormativity scale, meaning that she held really strong beliefs about heteronormativity, that gender and sex were the same thing, and that normal romantic relationships between male and female were considered quote unquote normal. However, after the intervention, so Aria is kind of like my target person. She was the one I wanted to change her mind. After the intervention, she said to me, I'd like to make it so that all of my units are like that, based around something like the sex verification testing of athletes. So even a student like Aria, who was very heteronormative to begin with, made large changes quantitatively And qualitatively, she started thinking about how she was going to design units around an anchoring event, like sex verification testing of athletes, which is really promising, powerful work. I was interested in also looking at what were some of the features of that intervention that really led to the changes that I observed. So I found 5 things. Group dialogue, coherence to ambitious science teaching. That's a framework. If you're not familiar with ambitious science teaching, definitely check it out. It's a phenomenal book and framework, particularly when you're working with pre-service and in-service teachers. GSD terminology. I feel like a great way to start is just understanding the difference between the different vocab words, and same goes for the students. That's really important, GSD terminology or language, because all of the students, and I'm going to, I need to actually unhide a slide, I'll show you, but all of the students talked about this idea of fearing being politically incorrect, and they were afraid to use the wrong words, so they just weren't using the language. So it really spoke to me in that there has to be concentrated efforts, particularly on helping folks learn the language. And that's really challenging because even within the community, there's not consensus on what many of these words and identities mean. So if within the community, we're having a hard time defining it, it can be challenging for others. But most importantly, providing a safe space for those teachers to engage in that dialogue, make mistakes, and then learn from those mistakes. I found that the knowledge of intersex hormones and LGBTQ scientists were really important for the intervention. And then finally, providing them with relevant case studies. I just want to unhide some of these just to show you a couple of the other themes that came out. So I've already spoke to this, but some of the other themes that I've found working with pre-service teachers is that they mostly talk about GSD from the perspective of student safety. I've already talked to you about Drew, but we can see one participant, Maddox, she talks about setting up a corner that has information for support groups and suicide prevention information. Aaron was talking about being an ally, providing a safe space. And then Drew is talking about those students being at higher risk of suicide, depression, and needing support. Again, I don't think that this is a bad place to start. We just have to move the conversation beyond this. There was a lot of othering language. So I want to go back to that quote. I'll go to a quote Arya said, which is doing stuff like that shows to those students that, hey, I'm a person. Like this is a space for us to talk about those things. It's really interesting here because Arya is trying to engage in some collective like we language, but then is also at the same time saying those students. So she's engaging in this rhetorical distancing from LGBTQ students and their experiences, which othering language can lead to a host of negative consequences for queer and trans students. And one of my favorite findings is that they often talked about it through what we call an add LGBT and stir approach. So they sprinkle it into their curriculum without ever doing some deep conversation with it. So Drew said he's going to bring in a diverse group of scientists. One participant said he would provide extra credit. That's about as additive as you can get. And then another student, Arya, said, I feel like there are a couple different ways. Oh, is this genetic or is there a gene that makes people gay or whatever, the karyotype thing. So talking about, well, I'll include this topic with karyotypes and talking about genetic markers for being gay. But beyond that, there wasn't this deeper disrupting, changing the curriculum as it was. And then finally, this idea of a fear of language. This really spoke to me. Aaron said, I feel like stuff gets updated and changed a lot, but my biggest worry is staying updated and even saying something that could potentially be offensive. Maddox says everyone makes mistakes when they're speaking and could accidentally say something offensive or not politically correct. And then Elliot says, one of the challenges I think I will face is not knowing the right thing to say. So again, language might be this really important key area for creating or fostering supportive teachers. So based on this study, I developed a few implications. I think that science teacher education programs should do things like provide coursework and field experiences that focus specifically on LGBTQ identities. Develop PD that goes beyond bullying and safety. Yes, start there. move the conversation forward to tap into equity and those critical perspectives as well. Integrate accurate knowledge of intersex, hormones, and LGBTQ scientists. Embrace the emotional discomfort around using GSD language. So again, providing that safe space and providing an opportunity for folks to collectively work through some of these concerns and fears. And then lastly, anchor this within a framework that talks about justice and equity, like ambitious science teaching. So I mentioned earlier that one of my deep passions is serving rural communities. That comes from my positionality. And so I've been working at the University of Missouri. I recently received some internal funding to take this project and work with rural science teachers across Missouri. So far I've done it with pre-service teachers, and now I'm working to take this out to in-service teachers. And the name of this PD workshop is Re-emphasizing Identities in Science Education. I want to pause here and just give you a brief story about this name because I think it speaks to the institutional work that still needs to happen. When I originally conceptualized this project, I understood the legal constraints of the state that I was in. So I don't know if you're familiar with this concept of a wink. It came out early with like, it was like an early commercial series that was really targeting like lesbian women. And so the idea was like, there was like this cue or a wink in the commercial that gave folks, okay, this is an inclusive commercial at the time. So I had to wink to my participants. How could I tell them what the PD was without using some of the language? And I have to admit that when I first approached somebody with power in my building, I was told, don't name it. That I was going to call it promoting rural inclusion, diversity, and equity, PRIDE, right? Because that PRIDE, I know people would know what it was, but I wasn't using LGBTQ, I wasn't using gender, sexuality, all of those things. But I was told, don't name it that because it will not get funded, right? So part of this whole battle has been, okay, well now I can't even do the research. I have to spend all my time coming up with a creative hidden name. So I only share that story to, again, speak to the institutional work that still needs to happen. Really important to this research project, which is starting this summer, is a focus on legal literacy. So I'm particularly interested in how can I support science teachers in developing their knowledge of the legal landscape so that they can do this work without fear of being fired within the constraints that they're provided. So part of this PD workshop is going to be connecting rural science teachers across Missouri with educational lawyers who specialize in LGBTQ law. So that's a really unique aspect of this project. So I'm back at this framework, and so far I've really been hanging out in the intervention box. So I'm focusing on teachers with pre-service teachers, and then this summer with RISE, I'm going to take it out to in-service teachers as well. But there's this other aspect, which is students. So this is where it's going to get a little interactive. Part of my research agenda is actually to develop an inclusive curriculum that I can put in the hands of teachers. And I mentioned the HHMI sex verification testing as a really important activity. And so this is a hot topic. It's all over the news. Olympic athletes like Caster Semenya, Dute Chand, there's a French athlete. They're all banned from participating in the Olympics because they identify as being trans. So this is a really real world topic. At the same time, students at the high school and middle school level also can't participate in school sports based on their gender identity. They have to based on their assigned sex at birth. So I developed a curriculum where I take students through the sex verification testing of Olympic athletes to show them that the binary of sex is not as binary. So I'm going to launch the activity with you all like I do with my pre-service science teachers. We start with the idea of testosterone. And I have students think, let's develop a list of starter ideas. Does a testosterone threshold distinguish between male and female athletes? And you might be able to see it, but on the graph, at that 10 nanomole per liter mark, that's the cutoff that the Olympic organizations have set. So if women are above that 10, they are disqualified from participating in women Olympic sports. There is no such rule for male athletes. But I'm curious, what are some things that you all see? What are some things that you think? And what might be some things that you wonder? Based on this graph and this question, does testosterone distinguish between male and females? Men are up top, women are on the bottom. Yeah. That says sports. So these are the 15 or 16 different sports of over 600 Olympic athletes that they sampled these levels from. Importantly, none of the athletes identified as intersex. They all identified as cis men or cis women as well. Each dot is a case within that sport. Correct. Any patterns that you're seeing? What do you notice about the women dots? Yeah.
So I will tell you what I see that in fact most women are below that level, but there are women who are above that level. I don't know how many groups are relative to each other. For men, there are a lot of men below that line. There are probably more men above that line. I wonder if there were more women in the sample, whether there actually are more women who come up above that line. There are just fewer of them, so because of the sample size.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great. Yeah.
I wonder about.
Okay. Yeah, so some of the patterns that the teachers point out, yes, most of the women are actually under that threshold and with only a few over it. And compared to males, where a majority of them are over that threshold, but there's no regulation for those males. What probably shakes my pre-service teachers the most is that when you look at sport one on the male side, you'll see that most of them fall below that threshold of testosterone. Does anybody want to take a guess as to what sport that is? Cycling? Yeah, it's gymnastics, actually. Or excuse me, no. It's powerlifting. And so this really shakes teachers because the gymnastics one is like 2 or 3. But the powerlifting, there's this idea that, okay, well, if males are powerlifting, they probably are pumping testosterone. They're pumping T. Well, it turns out that actually they're not, and they're actually below that threshold, right? So this leads to a host of conversations about, whoa, testosterone and estrogen, they're not useful, right? What's really interesting about this curriculum is I never use the words gender identity or sexual orientation because I can't. But the idea, my thinking is that kind of through this mechanism of nature of science, if I can show students that sex isn't that binary, perhaps they're going to translate that to things like sexual orientation, gender identity, these other aspects of gender and sexual diversity. That's me kind of creatively working within the legal constraints of Missouri. I've mentioned this before, but there's a broader connection to equity with this type of activity or this unit. We can see that 18 laws or 18 states have banned trans students from participating in sports, and this number has likely changed since then. For example, Missouri isn't highlighted, but it is now. So this is an older image. But we can see that this movement is quickly moving across the United States. And so where am I kind of heading from here? Well, I'm really interested right now in teachers, but eventually I like to take this research agenda to the student side. So then see, after teachers implement this sort of curriculum, what is the impact on student learning outcomes, all of which fall on the right side. I just haven't really gotten to that part of my framework yet. And finally, I just want to talk about research that I've done around mentoring. So mentoring is actually a really cool topic because it's actually one of the most important predictors of academic success, interest, and persistence for underserved students in STEM. And there's a specific need to provide mentoring opportunities for students living in rural communities, and there's a lack of mentoring programs for LGBTQ youth. So as part of my postdoc, I was involved in an NSF project where we developed a distance near-peer mentoring model where we connected students who were interested in STEM living in rural parts of North Carolina, and eventually we expanded that to Botswana, which changes the whole definition of rural, let me tell you. And we matched those students with college mentors who are pursuing a STEM degree. Really importantly, we matched those students based on similar interests, similar experiences, similar identities. So it's really this near-peer model. And we see that it impacts STEM identity through things like improved self-efficacy, improved value for STEM, and as well as students' persistence, enrollment, and intentions in STEM. And what you can see on the left is just the protocol that we developed as part of the NSF project. But I'm kind of moving away from that postdoc journey and taking those ideas and forming my own research agenda now, where I'm interested in expanding this to work specifically with LGBTQ youth. And there's a couple of interesting papers that really speak to this reciprocal role that mentoring relationships have, particularly with LGBTQ youth, meaning that it's not just the mentor who's teaching something to the mentee, but the mentee, which in this case could be LGBTQ youth, actually have a lot of things to teach mentors, teach adults. So both of these papers are focused on using LGBTQ youth in their advocacy and their organization strategies in order to teach multicultural education teachers, which I think is really powerful, this idea of let's have the students teach us. And so I'd like to wrap up with some concluding thoughts and then open the floor for some questions. Where am I heading from here? Well, I've already mentioned this. I'm really interested in research that talks about LGBTQ inclusion through a strengths perspective. So there's two terms that come up a lot in the literature, this idea of resilience and resistance. Resilience is often the term that is used. And it's defined as recovering from difficulties. The issue with framing research around resilience is it doesn't battle the thing that caused the difficulty to begin with. But if we change that perspective and look at a resistance perspective, or how do LGBTQ people confront and actually change dominant norms or resistance, that moves into this more asset-based approach. I'm interested in transing science education. So it's very easy or often the case that trans people are subsumed under this umbrella of LGBTQ. But in fact, trans people have a unique experience that impacts the way that they navigate educational spaces. So trans people have been mostly excluded as participants in research, and they're rarely conducted in the design, implementation, and dissemination of studies. I asked the seminar students to read a paper by my colleague, Dr. Ren Rendy. Their paper was just a transformative approach to gender inclusive science education. It was just awarded the NARST Outstanding Doctoral Research Award this year as well. And I think that that's really important because it speaks to the need to raise trans voices specifically in science education. They were also a third author on the paper that was accepted on the airplane. And finally, I'm really interested in this idea of LGBTQ multilingual learners. So I've been speaking with a colleague and we've been talking about, they focus a lot in language, science language learning, and they've been talking a lot about this idea of trans languaging. And I was interested in, well, have trans people been included in this conversation of trans languaging? And it turns out that they haven't. And so we're working to actually think about how do folks use language to identify themselves, to name themselves, to create categories for themselves oftentimes, but also how does it play out when there's different jargon or different terms from like a global context, for example, the global north and global south. very strong differences in even the terminology used to describe LGBTQ populations. So this is a space that we're just kind of diving into, and we're both really excited, my colleague Aisha Fackler and I, exploring. And then I just started that paper. It's a really important paper. So thank you all so much for listening. Ended just a few minutes early, but I hope to be able to take any questions that you might have.
Yeah, if you don't talk into the mic, the Zoom people can't hear you.
Hello. I was wondering how much interest you've had from the rural teachers in your summer program so far.
Very interesting question. I'm new to the area, so I'm still building those connections. I am finding that a lot of the urban teachers are the ones that are wanting to join, but I'm not letting too many of those in. So it has been a little challenging finding those rural teachers. And yeah, I think that there are teachers doing it. They're probably just doing it in secret, and they're probably just scared to say that they're doing it. So how can I tap into them? A funny story, a colleague of mine, she said, well, when I was recruiting teachers, I actually reached out to the art teacher who reached out to all the science teachers that they knew would participate. So I was like, oh, that's a really good idea. So I'm wondering, maybe instead of going directly to the teachers, if I find colleagues that have leeway with them, can kind of convince them or pass that information on. But it's still a work in progress, recruiting folks.
I'm going to ask you a psychology-inspired question.
Sure. I'll try my best.
Well, we think about this a lot, like people do science. And so when you have concerns about p-hacking to make things come out significant, it's often not a conscious choice. It's just, you know what you want. And I want to think the other way around. When the students come to your science class, the attitude that science is just science and that people don't matter and what you bring to the room doesn't matter seems like a really good way not to get future scientists out of that process. So in addition to LGBTQ plus identities, like, do you think much in science education about the role of science education in building scientists?
That's a really great question. There was a paper by some colleagues out of UNC Chapel Hill focused on this idea of queer temporality and futurity. And the idea was that the future, the present time, is not viewed as a safe space to be queer in STEM or to be out in STEM, but the future is. And so how do we make this sort of movement to create that future where the students are feeling safe and affirmed? I want to talk about your question about like p-hacking. Could you elaborate a little bit more about what you're asking about that?
Well, we spend a lot of time in psychology worried about measuring 3 dependent variables, and then one is significant and pretending the other 2 never happened, which actually increases your type 1 error to like 11% instead of 0.05. And so that whenever there's people involved, they're going to be motivated to do what people are motivated to do. And so we're acknowledging that even though we think we're doing science, if you take the person out of the equation, you're going to get a lot of bad science.
Yeah.
I don't know if y'all think about that as much in the biology and the chemistry side, that the idea that you don't even care who the people in the room are because we're just scientists seems like you're opening yourself up to the problems we're having with replication and fudging of the data.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that educators are a little bit different, but science educators are kind of similar, and oftentimes to those like dominant scientific perspectives as well. So it's not that necessarily science educators are incorporating these social identities. Some of them hold on to those objective, deterministic views of science, and I've seen that play out in their teaching. I've seen that play out in how they talk to students, and I've seen it play out with how they don't include certain topics in their discussions.
Thank you for a great presentation. You had mentioned like the feeling that now's maybe not a safe time, but sometime in the future it will be safe. And so kind of those cultural and sometimes religious contexts will make it like kind of difficult to address, this space. And I was wondering, did you build that into your framework somehow? Or like, I don't necessarily want to center any opposition or anything like that, but just wondering how you navigated that whole thing when you came up with your framework and your plan for your academic work.
That's really interesting. And while I didn't explicitly account for it in my framework, it kind of came out in one of my participants. So Jordan identified as a bisexual Muslim student. And he explicitly said to me multiple times in his interviews how he drew on his experiences as a Muslim student in classes not being represented, and how he could then use that to empathize and understand why it was then important to provide those opportunities for LGBTQ people. So while it wasn't explicitly part of the framework, it came out in that participant's discussion, and it really informed how he was approaching this, drawing from his own cultural background. So that was like one example. Maddox was another example. Maddox was I thinking about doing like a whole case study on Maddox, but she was very interesting because she comes from a very religious background, but she also has a queer brother, and so she talked about those tensions, how she navigated that among her parents, among her brother. So at least in that way, maybe not culture, but at least her background and how that shaped how she was approaching. She approached it by pretty much assuming that all of her students were her brother, which is a problematic stance, I think, but it was useful for her to develop empathy for those students.
Hello, how you doing? Thanks again for the talk. You said that you're now working with pre-service teachers with this, and you said you want to move on to the students. What are some of the things the obstacles you anticipate when? Because I'm pretty sure maybe the parents are going to get involved. What are some of those obstacles you anticipate with that, and do you have any ways, or are you thinking about some ways to kind of navigate around those obstacles?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I think the nature of this work in the state, like given the state's like restrictive legislation, it's going to present a unique set of challenges where some parents won't allow their children to participate in that type of research study. I just gather my thoughts. Can you repeat your question one more time?
I was saying, since you're looking to take this to students, and the parents are going to have to come into play, what are some of the obstacles you're kind of anticipating with the parents and being involved, and do you have any ways to maybe navigate, just like how when you had to frame this to get funding, have you got that far yet?
Yeah. Okay, I see. So yeah. There's a couple of parts to this. One, I lost my train of thought. Now I have it back. I think the nature of doing this work is that there's a ton of selection bias, meaning like at least with my pre-service teachers, the one who participated, there were 7 out of 17. So that tells you that those pre-service teachers were probably very different from the other 10 that didn't participate. I think that speaks to the fear around, can I even teach this? Can I do this? Is it important? I think the same will be true for students, that the students who opt in are probably going to be queer, trans, or have really supportive parents, or already have supportive or ally-like ideas about that. I think that the first step is to just tap into those people, because that's the context that I have, and I can't really change the legislation. So when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about tapping into like queer and trans teachers, or I'm okay with the fact that probably most of the students who opt in will be queer or trans. And I think grounding the research in those experiences will then have an impact on those folks who aren't necessarily part of that community or don't already hold those supportive attitudes. So to answer your question, it's going to be a battle. And yeah, I don't think I have a clear solution to it right now.
Other questions? Oh, okay. Because we have the film festival starting here at 6, and the popcorn's already been delivered, but y'all are welcome to stay for that. Can I ask another question then? Can we see a show of hands of people working on a PhD right now? And you're a reasonably junior faculty member. Do y'all want to know anything about that transition? Seems like y'all are about to be coming to the part where you become faculty members. Do you have any advice? I know it's a little off topic, but
I mean, it is wild, let me tell you. It is a wild experience to step into faculty role. There is nothing that prepares you for it. The amount of work, the amount of commitments, the amount of protect your time you're going to hear, and you're like, what time? Or like, I just don't have any time. I can't protect anymore. It's an experience. And I have to say, for me, it was really interesting as a queer person trying to decide where I was going to end up. I knew the context of Missouri, and my husband and we're not unhappy, but I think that we're kind of navigating this space and navigating how do I be a productive scholar when some of my personal liberties are at risk or not available to me. So my point being that I think one of my biggest pieces of advice is really shop around and find your right fit, because you can't thrive professionally. I don't care how much they pay you. I don't care how many startup funds they give you. You can't thrive professionally if you're not thriving personally. And so I think that that's a really key piece of advice as you're kind of finding your next home, next location. If it's a tenure track job, you'll probably be there for 6-7 years. So you probably want to find a good place where you want to settle in. But I can answer any other specific questions you might have about transitioning.
We'll make this the last one.
So I am really interested in the inclusion curriculum that I think will be coming out of possibly the rural teacher development. Do you have any ideas yet on the outlets that we'll go through, how we might access that, things of that nature? Because I am interested in accessing that myself for future teaching purposes.
Yeah, so we actually, me and my colleague, Dr. Rendy, who wrote that other paper, we just wrote a book chapter, and it's for practitioners, and the name of the book is Justice-Oriented Anchoring Phenomenon. And so it's going to be a chapter within that book, and it's written for practitioners. Literally, you can take this book, read the script as it is, and implement the activity as it is. So that is the outlet that it's going to be in for practitioner use.
So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Langston, for providing this venue and the opportunity for the MSc program to be involved in the event. Thank you, Dr. Wright, for making the trip from Columbia.